There it is. So we are going to spend some time over the next few weeks looking at, oh, wait a second, let's let in some more folks. And actually, that means I need to turn off the waiting room. There we go. Hi, John. So over the next few weeks, we're going to look at,
Hi, Pastor Jay.
hi, John.
Everybody.
Um,
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I am, we're going to take a look at the doctrine of discovery and its repudiation. So in 2016, the last time uh, two, uh, excuse me, two churchwide assemblies ago, the ELCA overwhelmingly voted. Everybody's going to need to stay on mute. We don't get that feedback. But in 2016, at Churchwide Assembly, the ELCA voted overwhelmingly to adopt a resolution that repudiates the doctrine of discovery. That doctrine of discovery, which we will talk about now for the next few weeks, is for many of us would be most closely associated with what we may have learned in school of manifest destiny, the idea that we are somehow, especially white folk, are somehow um, uh, destined to conquer, own, live on, use the land of the United States. Uh, but the doctrine of discovery is a much more global idea that is based on a papal encyclical. And so we will be looking at not only the resolution that we approved, but also we'll be looking at what that doctrine is, where it comes from, how we got to where we are today. The study, I have to admit, doesn't come entirely from me. A lot of it is sort of structured around a study guide that came out for a 2021 article in the Living Lutheran. So in September of 2021, the ELCA Church Council adopted a statement, a declaration to American Indian Alaska Native peoples. And shortly thereafter, an article was published about how the ELCA is living into the resolution that we passed in 2016. As with everything in the church, it's taken its good sweet time, but we are getting there. We are doing better. For those that are interested, you can find online, I can send you resources to see the ways that we are living into this resolution at our most recent churchwide assembly. For example, Dr. Irwin from the seminary led a native inspired worship on Wednesday, as well as a lengthy presentation on the work of the team that has been working on the ways that we are enacting our resolution. So give me just a moment. I have slides. I feel so special now. Um, but it's just easier this way. Um, what I will say is if we have some time when we're done, uh, I have the presentation from Vance Blackfox at Churchwide Assembly that we can watch together for those who were not aware or did not have the ability to watch that at the time. So as I said, the doctrine of discovery, as we understand it today and as we see its effects today, is centuries old. It dates back to the 15th century in 1455 um, with the papal encyclical Dum Diversas, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But really, it goes back to the age of exploration, which is sort of many of us would have heard of it as a global idea, but it's certainly a Southern and Western European idea of sort of in the 1500s, where there was just sort of this constant desire to explore beyond the confines of Europe. A lot of those voyages, a lot of the exploration uses the word discovery, right? The discovery of the Cape of Good Hope, the discovery of America, the discovery of sort of the faster route to Asia, the discovery of. And one of the things that we need to realize, particularly those of us with white ancestry, is that we didn't discover something that people knew existed before us. We encountered it, we found out about it, we learned about it, but you can't discover something somebody else knows about. But this language around discovery is sort of centers the white European narrative over anything else. And so part of what we're going to look at today is perhaps the most famous quote discovery, and it's probably not only the best known, but also the one that affects those of us who live in the United States most of all of these discoveries. So we're going to take a look at Columbus's discovery. So as we know, I'm going to assume most of us know the poem. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa, right? We can list off at least the date. But here in the United States, we specifically designate October 12th, or the Monday closest to it, as Columbus Day, which recognizes the exact day, October 12th, 1492, that Cristoforo Colombo and his entourage of settlers landed in the, quote, West Indies, which is what Colombo will call it his entire life. The idea is that he was looking for a faster route, both sort of this general exploration, but ideally for him, he wanted to find a faster route heading west to get to the Spice Islands, to get to India, to get to the riches of what we would think of as the Far East. Of course, on a globe, there really isn't an east and a west, but that he was looking for a faster route, and he lands in the Bahamas. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but it's this idea that he wants to find this faster route to India. He gets to a place that he knows is not the same as the Spice Islands or India, because enough people had been there the long way that he knew this wasn't quite the same, but he still was convinced this was a discovery of some other part of that same landmass, which we would think of as Asia. And so this is the, quote, discovery, as we will, as many of the United States celebrate it. This is the, quote, discovery of America. It's not, as we will see, it's not a discovery. It's not what we would think of as America, and it's definitely not what Columbus thought it was. So as I said, Columbus thinks that he is in the West Indies instead of the East Indies, but he thinks it's sort of all the same thing. And that's something that he won't give up on for his entire life. The other thing for us to realize is that we remember that he is funded, at least in this first exploration, by who else but Ferdinand and Isabella. These, a lot of these facts are things that should be pretty familiar when we talk about sort of the general story. They are the Catholic monarchs of Spain. And that is incredibly important to the story, and we'll see why in a few slides. But they are the rulers of Castile and Aragon, sort of the unification, in a way-ish, of Spain. And they are the ones finally that fund Columbus's expedition. So let's start at the beginning. Who was Columbus? Who is this, quote, discoverer of America? Well, he's, first of all, not Spanish. He is Italian. Cristoforo Colombo was born at some point, we think in the spring of 1451 in the Republic of Genoa, in what we would think of as present-day Italy. Of course, pre-1860s, Italy isn't a concept, so he is part of the nation state of the Republic of Genoa. And he's very ambitious. We don't know a whole lot about the family he comes from, but we know he's very ambitious. We know he is well studied. He has this grand idea to be an explorer and a navigator. Born Cristoforo Colombo, we in the United States will call him Christopher Columbus because we love making things easier for us to say and with far less vowels. But as I said, he sort of had these grand ideas for exploration and navigation of the world. And so he actually tries first with his own government, the government of the Genovese, to get them to fund this exploration. It would be a lot easier if we could find our own trade routes, and especially if they were shorter. And I think we can do that by going the other way, right? So he tries this with the Genoese. This doesn't, nobody's interested. Everybody kind of laughs. But Italy's not on the open ocean, right? Italy is on the Mediterranean. They still have sort of their connections throughout the Mediterranean, realizing how that works. He approaches the Portuguese, which once you start heading west is kind of the first landmass you bump into. They're not so enthralled by the idea either. But finally, he ends up with the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, they are relatively new on the scene. They also are incredibly powerful and incredibly rich because they are relatively new to the throne. Spain is not in any particular war at the time, and because this is the first time that the Castilian and the Aragonian governments, monarchies, nation states had been unified. So the way this marriage works is that Ferdinand was the king of Aragon, which is a sub-state of what we think of as Spain. Isabel was queen of Castile, a sub-state of what we think of as present-day Spain, and they get married. And we sort of assume this is the unification of Spain into a single monarchy kingdom realm. They still were very independent rulers. There still was very much the understanding that while together they ruled the entire land mass that we think of as Spain, they each had power in their own right. So that this wasn't the idea that like Ferdinand was king of Spain and by marrying him, Isabella was queen of Spain. This was both of them coming with relatively equal and very necessary power, wealth, strength that will sort of play out then in the fact that they bring with them sort of this equal power and together sort of face the world. They were the same monarchs, this Ferdinand and Isabella were the same monarchs as the, quote, Catholic monarchs. That's with capital letters, capital C, capital M. They are the Catholic monarchs of Spain. So these are the same monarchs that were responsible for the Spanish Inquisition. They were responsible for the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. These are the parents of Catherine of Aragon, the first wife and, depending how you think about it, only wife of Henry VIII. These are very powerful, very well connected, very Catholic monarchs. They are very, very well connected to the Pope. The Pope sort of seeks out their help as much as they seek out his. That connection is very, very deep and is part of the reasons behind their sponsorship of Columbus's expeditions. Because Columbus is proposing a faster route to do what everyone else has already done. That's not a whole lot to go on. We're guessing, we're hoping, we have no way of knowing. At the time, this is a land, what Columbus ends up bumping into is not in any way known at the time, but we think if we go this way, we can get to India faster. There's not a lot there, but there wasn't a lot that was needed at the time for this idea of exploration. This was the age of exploration. This was the age of the explorers. You can probably name a number of them, right? Columbus and Ponce de Leon and Amerigo Vespucci and Magellan, right? This is all of these folks that we think of as finding all of these routes by sea. This is the age-ish, within a few decades. This is the age of all of that work being done. The reasons for most people were goods, gold. For some folks, depending on what ended up being found, there were goals of land expansion, of slaves, but also, and this is something we cannot discount too much, and that we need to take particularly seriously as members of the Church of the 21st century, there also was this expectation of the ways that evangelism and empire went hand in hand. Church and colonialism, empire and evangelism, these are all deeply, deeply tied to one another from beginning in this era. Like I said, beginning with 1455. So throughout basically the entire Common Era, so start post-Jesus ascension, the church writ large, certainly beginning in the 3rd century when we have the emperor supporting the church has often been partnered with the empire. It was the state religion. Christianity became the state religion, arguably with Constantine, but certainly once we get into the 600, 700 era, sort of what we think of as the medieval ages, the church is the state religion. It's the state religion in the Roman Empire. Once the Roman Empire falls and disintegrates, it remains the state religion of most of the governments that remain throughout Europe. Now, this is the other thing that we need to remember, is that what we can't think about right now is the idea that the church is a global institution. The church as we know it is a European, largely Mediterranean inspired institution of religion. It is known around the Mediterranean Sea, and there are vestiges of it that sort of go as far as India, 1 or 2 in China, but there is not sort of this global understanding of Christianity at the time. It is sort of spreads out from the Mediterranean, particularly out of Rome, particularly out of Alexandria, particularly out of Istanbul, are sort of the 3 major centers that sort of spread this outward. The reason that church and empire work so well together is largely what people think of as evangelization, the spread of the gospel. This is what the church says. If you're going to go exploring anyway, let's send some monks along to proclaim the word of the Lord that will tell the good news of Jesus, will sort of convert the heathen, because this is what we're told to do: go and make disciples, baptize all nations. So if you're going, we might as well send some of our monks along. The Jesuits will be very big into this. This will be a big part of their identity. But what we have come to see, and what we see when we use a more objective view, is that evangelization is less about telling the story and allowing it to work in people's lives, and much more about forced conversion in the face of death or enslavement. If you're not Christian, too bad, right? It's be Christian or bust. Christianity is seen, because of this connection with empire, Christianity is seen as sort of the civilized religion. It's a mark of civilization, as much as it is a life of faith. We're going to talk all about the various papal encyclicals and decrees next week, but I do want to bring up the very first one. So in 1452, Alexander V issued a decree called Dum Diversas, of many things. In that, Alexander V guides European, particularly Southern and Western European perspectives on exploration. In a nutshell, and again, we'll talk more about this next week, but in a nutshell, what this encyclical says is that anyone who is encountered who is not already Christian, if they didn't convert, could be enslaved. Because, again, with Christianity being a mark of civilization, they were sort of in this less than human status. If you didn't have Christianity, you didn't have anything, and therefore you were open to being enslaved. This, from 1452, will go on to affect everything into the 19th century and beyond, particularly here in the United States, particularly in a country that holds on to slavery, well into what we would think of as modern history. And a lot of that comes from this idea that if you don't look like, sound like, believe like, if you don't have the marks of civilization that the white folk think are the marks of civilization, then really all you're good for is manual labor. And so we see the ways that that works on the slave trade, not just in the 1400s, but all the way into, sadly, very close to present day. And the ways that it still affects our perceptions, particularly as white folk, how it affects our perceptions of the quote other, right? When we think of Christianity, when we think of sort of how Christianity, how white folk encounter the other, a lot of it is based around religion. A lot of it is based around faith. A lot of it is based around sort of country of origin and skin color, which sort of all is looped up in this. But as I said, we'll talk more about those encyclicals next week. So, how does this play out in the end? Why is this such a problem? Why is this something that we really need to stand up against? This idea of the quote discovery of America. Why is it that that we as people of the church are called to really tell the truth about what was happening? And I would argue it's from, we can hear it from this very first entry from Columbus's voyage journal of his first encounter with the native inhabitants of what he decides is called San Salvador, but which was actually Guanahani, so that the local indigenous folk had a name for the place where they lived, go figure. But Columbus decided it was called San Salvador. So here's, in his journal, which would be sent back to Ferdinand and Isabella, here is what Columbus says. I saw some indigenous people who had marks of wounds on their bodies, and I made signs to them asking what they were. And they showed me how people from other islands nearby came there and tried to take them, and how they defended themselves. And I believed and believe that they come here from Tierra Firma to take them captive. They should be good and this is the native Guanahanians. They should be good and intelligent servants, for I see that they say very quickly everything that is said to them. And I believe they would become Christians very easily, for it seemed to me that they had no religion. Our Lord pleasing, at the time of my departure, I will take 6 of them from here to your highnesses, in order that they may learn to speak. If this doesn't make you think twice, we should think about, like, this should make us think twice. There are so many assumptions that Christopher Columbus has about the native Guanahanians. The first is that in some way they are victims. The second is that they immediately, his first thought is that they'll be good servants, not, oh, these will be good allies. Oh, these will be good equals. Ooh, I should learn their language. No, they should be good and intelligent servants because they will repeat back what I say to them. Not they understand the language, just they can parrot back what I say to them. And then he says, I believe they would become Christians very easily, for it seems that they had no religion. I don't know about the last time you met anybody you hadn't met before. So you walk up to a stranger, and within first meeting, how quickly you learn what their religion is. But I think this assumption that they have no religion, they have no language, they have, all these assumptions that Christopher Columbus makes is because he shows up and there's not a church. They have darker skin. And so he can make some assumptions. The last assumption he makes, and this is one that my jaw dropped when I read it, I will take 6 of them. When I go home, I'm just going to take 6 of them to the King and Queen of Spain in order that they may learn to speak. So again, we're assuming that because we don't understand the language, they don't speak. It's just, there's so many assumptions that I think we don't realize. We're not just assumed, we're not reading back onto Christopher Columbus anything he didn't already say. What we have are his exact words and his assumptions about the people he encounters. All of which is marked by this understanding of the world from this papal encyclical. From the church's perspective, these are people that without the church weren't much to think of. They didn't have the civilization that people thought there was. And we see then this close tie between church and colonialism, between empire and evangelism. We see this close tie because his first thoughts are they will make good servants. They will, because they can parrot the language. They'll become Christians easily because if they're not Christian, they don't have religion. And we will then be able to teach them to speak. Arguably to speak sort of medieval Spanish, but speak something. Here's where the problem is. Here's where the problem starts. And this is then what we celebrate, if you will, on the Monday closest to October 12th with Columbus Day here in the United States. The quote, discovery of America is Christopher Columbus landing on San Salvador and conquering a people because he didn't think that they could survive without him. The problem. It is a problem, and it's a problem that we need to be aware of, and it's a problem that we need to confront, not just as cognizant, conscious world citizens, but as members of the church, because of the ways that Christianity and the church have been and continue to be deeply associated with things like this worldview. So, as far as the quote discovery of America, which is what we all know, right? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. Well, this first voyage where he lands on San Salvador was successful. People, gold, resources, he found all of it. It wasn't, though, India. So Columbus ends up making 4 voyages to the sort of Caribbean. And despite over the decade or more that he travels, despite the fact that more than a few people find this same landmass, and they all are able to sort of prove by their map making and their explorations that this landmass is not Asia, Columbus never acknowledges that he was on any other continent than Asia. An island, yes. So it wasn't mainland Asia, but he insists that he was successful and found a shorter way to Asia, which is why he calls it the West Indies. And this is where Indian, as a term for those native of America, comes from, right? If you've ever wondered why American Indians are called American Indians, it's because of this quote discovery. It's because of this label that Columbus puts on them, even though his own peers at the time knew that these weren't in any way related to Indians, like actual Indians. But someone else does realize this is a quote new world. This is a new continent. This is a new landmass, and that's Amerigo Vespucci. So Amerigo Vespucci, what is this? 10 years, less than 10 years after Columbus's first voyage, also sails west, and he lands near Suriname, which is sort of on the north coast of South America. And he almost immediately recognizes that this landmass is completely new, that where he is not India, is not Asia, is not anything that they've known before, but is at least somewhat related to what Columbus found, because he sees some of the similarities and he followed much of Columbus's courses. And because of this recognition of a completely new landmass, America is named for Amerigo Vespucci, not for Columbus, even though in theory, maybe Columbus got here earlier, but did he? It becomes really blurry because it's not until much later that we will recognize and declare a distinction between North America, Central America, South America, which is really all one landmass. This is one landmass until the Panama Canal. This was all one landmass. We were connected from tip to toe. We later will make these distinctions, largely because of colonialism, because of the ways that America will sort of come and delineate the pieces of this landmass. So it's a little hard to tell sort of who's first, where are they, what can we sort of have as first European footfall on America, because it's a big landmass. It's a big landmass. And so who was first? Well, where were they stepping? But America will be named for Amerigo Vespucci, even though Columbus predates him by about 10 years. But it's really the fact that Columbus thinks that he's somewhere in Asia, which he's not, but he thinks he is. So it's when Amerigo Vespucci says, no, this is something new, that it gets named for him. So what do we do with this America? Well, first, despite being on a landmass named for Vespucci, the United States maintains some deep connections to the myth of Christopher Columbus being the discoverer of America. And as many of us in the United States of America will know, there are many who think that America, the term, is only for the United States of America, which it is not. But Columbia is. So some of these deep ties to the myth of Christopher Columbus come with the idea of Columbia. So even though it's arguable whether or not Columbus actually stepped foot on the land that we will know as the United States or any of its territories, Columbia plays large in the myth of America. So, in the manner of the ancient world, Columbia is actually seen as the personification of the United States. A woman in a toga, even. If we think of like Roma, the personification of Rome, it's very much in the same idea. And we have hints of this Columbia, the District of Columbia, if you've ever wondered why Washington, D.C. is named as it is. This Columbia is this connection back to Columbus. Hail Columbia by Sousa is still the fanfare for the vice president. The reason why this isn't as familiar in the 20th and 21st century is because once the Statue of Liberty is officially finished, Lady Liberty sort of displaces Columbia. Very much still with the toga, with the female personification of an ideal, sort of with all of that, but sort of takes on this new era of what that personification is and what it means for us and for the world. But any of your Columbuses and your Columbias that are named throughout the United States, of which there are more than a few, particularly on the East Coast, all of those connections are back to this Christopher Columbus, are back to this idea that Columbus somehow is the first person to step onto and quote discover America, and the United States will claim America as ours for a very long time. And so we still have these deep, deep ties to it, even though largely it's a myth. It's sort of unclear whether Columbus himself actually stepped on land that is currently controlled by the United States. But it's a myth that continues, and it is strong, and it even has a day on the federal holiday calendar for it. So what I want to do is first ask if y'all have any questions, comments, wondering why I've been rambling about this, but I want to open up if anybody has questions or comments now.
Did Columbus make out financially in all this or not?
Well, he kept doing it, so I would assume so. Yes, he very much. Anybody almost, except for Magellan and everybody that gets eaten on his voyage. Most of the people that end up coming west from Europe end up with financial gain, whether that was from actual gold or from the goods that were from here. So especially once Columbus starts making more journeys, more is learned about the native people and what is tradable goods, right? For a people for whom gold is a common metal, such as here in the United, as here in America, in the Americas, there's lots of other things that were able to be traded for that, and many things, frankly, let's be honest, that get stolen once Columbus comes with larger and larger forces. But also we can't discount the lucrative business of people So, the first time Columbus steps foot on San Salvador, he decides he's taking back people to be servants. And this becomes a centuries-long trade that becomes very, very lucrative. Money made for Europeans on the back of non-Europeans. So yes, he at least breaks even enough that he wants to keep doing it. But yes, it is a success. Let's put it that way.
Okay, thanks.
So I want to take a moment now, since we have a few minutes, I want us to listen to Vance Black Fox's presentation at Churchwide Assembly, because his position at the ELCA Churchwide office is part of how we as a whole are living into our repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery, and we'll get more into that next week with all of those papal encyclicals, is that idea that starts with Dum Diversas, which is anything and anyone encountered that's not Christian is open for subjugation. That any land that doesn't have a church on it is open for conquering, because that's what that's what, conquer for empire and for church. That's what we repudiated, that idea that there's that connection, that people don't have inherent value, that land doesn't have its own inherent value without church. But part of the way we're living into that is by having someone at an ethnic specific desk for native, well, I'll let him tell you about that. So this is from this year's Churchwide Assembly on Wednesday. This is part of a larger presentation on the declaration of the ELCA to American Indian and Alaska Native peoples, but this is particularly Vance Black Fox. Just a second, let me make sure I'm sharing my sound. Right. Share. It's been so long since I've done the share computer sound. There we go.
Since this group began meeting, we did some major restructuring of the church. And one of the things we did was to reimagine the staff position associated with some of this work. Vance Black Fox is Director of Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations, a new position that will help our church learn how to be in better and right relationships with our Indigenous siblings, and to better understand our relationships and work with the 574 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States. Vance will close with comments on where we go from here.
Osio Nagad, Galanchi Dawado. Hello everybody, my name is Galanchi. My English name is Vance Black Fox. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I do have the privilege and honor of serving this church as the first Director of Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations, and I am so grateful for that opportunity. I'm also very grateful to be looking out amongst this crowd, amongst a bit of sea of red, as we acknowledge and recognize murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls and relatives who we still are missing and still miss. My position at the ELCA has been one that has been so exciting over the last year. I have not only gotten to work with amazing colleagues at the church-wide organization, but I've also had the opportunity to work with this amazing team of folks on the task force. So please give them another round of applause. As we do this work together, me, in my office, the American Indian and Alaska Native Lutheran Association, and the repudiation of the Doctrine and Discovery Task Force, and so many other allies, and co-journeyers in this work. I think about how important it is for us to also understand that this is a new way of doing work with Indigenous people, with Native nations. In my work in tribal relations, it's not only to build relationships with sovereign nations across this land, across Turtle Island, but it's also to help this church understand how to be in better relationship, right relationship with those sovereign nations. Part of that work in building those relationships is understanding our need as a church, as Christians, to focus our energies and our attention on what it means to be telling the truth and to heal. People often ask me, how did you end up in this position? And let me just tell you, and I've told this joke over and over, I never wanted this job. And I'm really mad that I'm loving it so much. But one of the reasons I'm loving it so much is because when I say that my call to this church has to be, because I can't explain it any other way, has to be that I'm here to help white people heal. That the Creator and my ancestors, including my dear adopted Ho-Chunk mother, Marlene, whom I'm grieving at the moment, would have it no other way. That I give myself to the service of the people of color and the Indigenous peoples of this church, but also to all of you who live in the privilege of being the majority church. It's time to make a change. But that healing work that I'm seeing happen, that's allowing for my job to be a bit easier, because when I say that, I'm already seeing some of you do it. I think about my colleague Amy Ruman and her team in advocacy, who continue to be on the forefront in DC and other places to make sure that Indigenous issues are in front of our church. And then when we have over 2,000 letters written to our leaders of this nation in Congress about Indian boarding schools and the commission that we hope to have happen in this country to make sure healing and truth telling is done, I'm just so grateful. And I see you doing that work. I think about the opportunity to teach about equity. Those of you who know me know that I once upon a time worked for Native Americans in philanthropy. And we always had to have the conversation about what does it mean that in philanthropy, this includes the church, that out of the billions of dollars that are spent from charitable organizations and foundations in our churches, only 0.4% of those billions of dollars go to Native organizations. And we never have the conversation in this church that we're having in philanthropy about the fact that 2% of the population and 2% of those $1 billion is not equity. Because the wealth built in the foundations, charitable organizations, in philanthropy, in these churches, in our churches around this country, was built on resources like timber, ore, uranium, railroad. It was built on Native land. And so equity indeed is 100%. Now we know that's not a reality, but indeed in this church, like in philanthropy and other places, equity has to be learned and evaluated in our minds. Some of the things that we are working on in this church is a gift from World Hunger, which we're thankful for, that will support the work that some synods, like Colleen Berneau and others, and Bishop Ogren, have been doing on murdered and missing Indigenous women, which will start this fall. We have begun a Indian boarding school initiative. An organizer by the name of Liz Andrus, whom I'm become great friends with and appreciate her collegial nature and support of this work. But we're starting in 15 synods. Some of you in your synods may have already seen that communication happen, seeking researchers and people who might be passionate about helping us find how our Lutheran church bodies have been involved in the atrocities of Indian boarding schools over time. the time for truth and healing in regard to that devastating period in our history of this country, your history. Time to address it is now, and so we're grateful for the beginning of that initiative. I want to thank you again, congregations, synods, individuals, whom I've had the chance again to hear from, to meet with, to witness in different ways, the ways in which you are stepping up to be advocates and fellow journeyers in justice for Indigenous peoples in this church and in your communities. Once upon a time, we were known, the Lutherans were known as the advocates, as the fellow co-journeyers with Indigenous peoples. In the 60s and 70s, the Lutheran churches came together to support the American Indian movement and Indigenous peoples across this land. If you have not heard this story, you must hear it. We even have a documentary to tell that story. I'll be putting that on the webpage soon. But we must remember that we were the leaders. This church, this faith, this theology, your ancestors were the leaders in doing the right thing for Indigenous people, for being in right and better relationships with Indigenous nations. And so what does that mean for us today? It means the bar has already been set because we're not quite there now. But we have an incredible example of the way in which we should engage in this work with our Indigenous neighbors, our Indigenous siblings, our Indigenous relatives, to ensure that justice finally happens, that we understand our relationship with sovereign nations and individuals who are members or citizens of those sovereign nations. One of the ways that we can do this, of course, is to continue building our relationships with the sovereign nations, the native nations in our places that we come from, but also with Native organizations. One of the Native organizations that we must be in relationship and that we are continuing to grow at the encouragement of Reverend Marlene White Rabbit Helkemo and many others is our relationship with the National Congress of American Indians, of which I'm a lifetime member. They are doing the work, the representative work, the lobbying, the educating, the advocacy, and so many other things. And at one point in time, we were in a deeper relationship. One of our Lutheran theologians of before, Vine Deloria Jr., was the elected executive director of NCAI and saved it, turned it around from 19 members to nearly 200. We have a history, we have a heritage of doing the right thing, and we will continue to do that. I truly believe it. And so building relationships with the National Congress of American Indians, with the National Boarding School Healing Coalition, with the National Indian Education Association, and so many more, right relationship will happen. This church can be the leader, at least within our Christian community, can be the leader at doing this justice work with and for Indigenous peoples. This, I do believe. Thank you.
Can't hear you.
You know, it would be helpful if I muted myself. So that is sort of the impetus, that is the call, that is what we are charged to do as the ELCA, at least in part, from one of the people spearheading the work here in the ELCA. It is partly why we are having this conversation. This is something that has come to the forefront and is really being put into action by the ELCA, especially after this most recent churchwide assembly. And so why timely this study is for us. For those that don't know, and for those that have not seen or missed the announcements, part of the ways that we are at least beginning some of these acknowledgements at Christ Ascension, if you've not read the inside cover of your bulletin recently, We have our land acknowledgement, which also appears at the bottom of the e-news. It appears on our website. It appears anytime that we have a publication. In addition to that, the orange banner that hangs in our sanctuary, I just moved it this past Sunday, but that orange banner was by invitation of the American Indian Alaska Native Lutheran Association. That is in solidarity with those lost to Indian boarding schools, which is, I'd say how many, but it seems like there's more every time we talk about it. But that in solidarity with those that are lost and those that mourn, we have that orange banner in our sanctuary. It was originally an invitation to hang for about 250 days in recognition of the 250 that were lost. At the time, the numbers keep going up, so the banner keeps staying there, because it's an important thing for us to remember the ways that is a very specific way that the church in the United States was connected to the persecution of our indigenous siblings, which was the sort of forced assimilation of indigenous children to be more white Christian, to lose their language, to lose their style, to lose their culture, to lose their religion, to be more what we thought of as civilized. And that this was often done through boarding schools that were run by the church, by missionaries, by Christians. And so that is certainly one of those places that we recognize the need for more work. We've hit the 8 o'clock hour, but are there any final questions or comments? Seeing none, and just a second, I can give you, next week we are studying, next week we look at the encyclicals themselves. So next week we look at the actual doctrine of discovery. We will look at 4 papal encyclicals and the ways that they were then enacted and the ways that they influenced sort of our United States understanding of this doctrine. As I said, the doctrine of discovery is what we call it because it is a doctrine based on Catholic teaching from before the Lutheran Church was even a thing, that we still see in the sort of ideas of manifest destiny in the United States, which, while perhaps not as vocally taught, it is still somewhat in our sort of general understandings. But we'll talk more about that next week. So I thank you all for being here with me. This has been fun, and we will see you next week.